If you're watching this, chances are you are a student in my English 102 class, and this is a slideshow on the question of credible sources. As a writer in English 102, you will be expected to understand what constitutes a credible source and to avoid sources which are not credible in your research writing. This is a way to begin to do this effectively and to have a sense of what to look for and when to look for it. So I called this slideshow Who You Can Trust, or Who Can You Trust? And it's about figuring out whether a source is credible and useful to your paper's argument. Students sometimes learn in high school to include quotations in a paper like this, but it's a bad idea. Everyone knows by the time they're a junior or senior in high school that they'll be expected to quote experts of some kind to support ideas in a paper. But there's a wrong way to do it, and allow me to show you why it is wrong. Let's say I am arguing that raising pets is a good way to build character in children. Someone might make an informed argument of that nature. I might just go to a website that has a lot of quotes. There are things like brainyquote.com that do this, and says somebody who says, I find dogs are the most valuable part of society. I then just cite the website, so I'm not plagiarizing that gave me the quotation, and I turn it in. Simple as that, right? What's wrong with that? Well, this dog wants to know. The first problem is I don't really understand who's talking to me. And if I am the professor grading the student's paper, I don't know that this student knows. This might be a great quotation that supports the claim of the paper that socializing children is done well with giving them responsibility over pets. And this might be a great quotation. Dogs are the most valuable part of our society, someone said. But what if the author is controversial? You know who liked dogs? Adolf Hitler liked dogs. And I'm not sure that a student ought to quote Adolf Hitler on in a paper on pet management, especially advocating for ownership of dogs. Basically, if someone as bad as Hitler owned a dog, that's actually an argument against owning a dog. Also, if a student turns into me a quotation from someone and I know this person didn't consider the totality of that quoted person's record on life in general, that person is very likely to get a bad grade. I one time had a student turn in a paper about honesty and criminal justice reform, but he didn't know he was quoting a rich man who had gone to jail for most of his life for white-collar crime. And the fact that he didn't know it was enough for me to give him a bad grade because it was relevant to his topic that this person had spent time in prison. And the fact that he didn't do enough research to find that out let me know he was not completing the parameters of the assignment. So don't be that student. Don't quote Hitler without knowing it's Hitler. Basically, you see this scary, nasty dog. Before I quote anybody in a college paper, I have to know a lot of things about the words I cite, because otherwise they could really come back to bite me. And here are some important questions I need to ask before I quote anybody or anything in a paper. This is honestly as important as knowing who you are talking to when you write. You don't write the same way you text your best friend when you write a college paper. I believe you learned that in English 101. But who is talking to you is equally important in a research paper. I want to know not just the name, but the larger career of the person who said the thing. Not knowing Hitler was the one doing the talking, or perhaps not knowing what Hitler did other than like dogs, would be a bad situation for me as a student writer writing about dogs. I also need to know by what authority the person can claim expertise on the topic at hand. In other words, what qualifies this person to know what he or she claims to know? This matters. For instance, what is wrong with this quotation? Here we see movie star Anne Hathaway in a down moment with her Labrador. She is walking, one assumes, in Southern California based on the landscape. And imagine she said for a moment, dogs are more susceptible to heartworm than people are to malaria. What would be wrong with that quotation for a college paper? A lot. First of all, Anne Hathaway is an expert, but she's an expert in something other than what I am quoting her for in the paper. She acts in movies. If I was doing a story about women in Hollywood or preparing to act, she might be a fantastic expert to include. But what does she know about veterinary science or human diseases? Is she an expert in malaria? I have no reason to think she is. Um, just because she's famous doesn't help a student prove his or her point that pet ownership helps children learn social skills. And furthermore, because this is a movie star celebrity, if this is just a quote that I saw circulating on the internet, I really may not know that she said it. Movie stars get misquoted all the time in tabloids because we are always hungry to hear about gossip, about romances between our favorite celebrities and such. So Anne Hathaway would be a false authority on the topic of pet diseases, and if, let's say, the quote appeared in the National Enquirer, it's not worth the paper it's printed on. It's not a credible news source. So my point is, I need to know how faithfully the words were recorded and not just the authority by which the person spoke them. So how can I tell if I can trust the source? The who is talking to me is not just Anne Hathaway. For instance, in that last quote, it would be, where did the quote originally come from? Am I reading this in a veterinary science journal that somehow decided to talk about the wisdom of celebrities and their pets? Or am I reading the National Enquirer while I wait at the checkout at the supermarket? For academic papers, you clearly want to avoid the National Enquirer in most situations. There are usually two general kinds of credible sources. One is fact-checked media. I'm going to go into that in some detail. And peer-reviewed sources. Both are important. Fact-check media generally is divided into newspaper sources, magazines, things that are printed, although such sources increasingly have an online presence. Or, for instance, the man in this picture, Walter Cronkite, was for decades considered by Americans, according to the polling done, the most trusted man in America. He was the anchor of the CBS Evening News. And so there are video and audio programs that are in the media. The question is to ask, do they fact check? Breitbart News, for instance, something that many people read, is effectively a blog. They don't check facts. But there are conservative papers like the magazine, actually, National Review, is an incredibly meticulously fact-checked news source. It's important to know what does or doesn't check facts on or off the internet and in media. For peer-reviewed sources, we're considering academic journals, and I'll talk about what peer-reviewed means in some detail. Honestly, when I was a college freshman, this is more like what those journals look like. Today, you go to the library database, and those kinds of sources are posted online in electronic form rather more than the way that we see here. So fact-checked media, let's talk about what that is. Not all news sources hire fact checkers or bother in any significant way to check facts. But most magazines that are not just trying to sell sensation, but rather to sell the credibility with which they can declare something based on their hardcore, careful research with substantiated fact-checking through multiple sources, sometimes audio recordings of an anonymous source speaking who is in a position of authority to know something that is confirmed through multiple kinds of research. Especially if such a credible newspaper makes a radical claim, they would really need to know that. Why? Because they will get sued. They will get so sued they get put out of business. If indeed they are saying something which is not a credible thing to say. So they hire people whose only job at the paper or the magazine is to double check what reporters bring in. And understand, I mentioned conservative news. It's not only conservative news that may or may not hire fact checkers. The New York Times is actually trusted by insurance companies because everything that they say is fact checked. For instance, if your family was affected by flooding, there is a good chance that in the privately held insurance policy that supported financial reparations for flood insurance in the event of a natural disaster, the clause literally says that the event must appear in either the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. One of those papers is liberal, the other is conservative. That is how much people who hand out money care about who is checking facts. So, but there are other liberal publications that don't check facts. I think, for instance, of something called rawstory.com that has a lot of liberal stories, and they don't bother to check much of anything. They say, well, we're raw. Well, being raw, then basically what they are is rumor story. And so fake news is not just news that the reader doesn't like. President Trump is fond of calling anybody he disagrees with a purveyor of fake news in the media. But actually, fake news is something that is not verified or is unverifiable. And academic writers and perhaps all kinds of thinkers need to stop believing people who don't check their stories before they shout them from the rooftops. I think that anybody who went to a high school where someone was called a slut knows this to be true. And that plays out in adult life differently, but it's still the same problem. How do you know so-and-so is a slut? What evidence do you have that so-and-so is a slut? Becomes something like, how do you know that particular industry polluted? Peer-reviewed journals are something different. The author's work is reviewed by multiple experts before the work is published as sound thinking in the field in which it professes expertise. In other words, let's say I'm a doctor, I'm a pediatrician, and what I do is I write a paper based on a study I did that proves something about a medication that children take, and I say it's dangerous for children to take it. That before they thought it wasn't dangerous, and now I say my study proves that it does seem dangerous. Pediatrics Monthly, imagine that as a peer-reviewed journal, would hire a dozen experienced and established pediatricians with expertise maybe specific to the area I was talking about of medication to double check my study and double check my findings. Does the study point to what I claim it does? Did I do the right methodology in the study to not make a mistake? And before they publish it, they will double check so that when a pediatrician buys their journal and he or she reads about this medication shouldn't be used anymore, that pediatrician can know for certain that I have provided information in my study and my findings that are useful. And even when we're not talking about studies, in peer-reviewed journals, people have a dozen or so experts check whether or not the claims of the person who is publishing the article did due diligence. Did this person check with other established sources in the area? And even if they disagree, did they respond responsibly to what that person said? Is what they wrote a responsible part of the professional consideration of that particular field? If there is, for any reason why the person didn't do a study or didn't rely correctly on sources that are proven to be credible, the work won't get published by a peer-reviewed journal. They're very careful. Their reputations depend on that. That's why people read them. You are recommended in college to read such things because those things have been established as factual. But even if you're looking at a fact-checked newspaper, which for many topics may make a lot of sense to do, it's important to understand the difference between two different things. Reportage or analysis, sometimes just called news reporting, um, and editorials. Let me explain what each of these are. Articles that qualify as analysis or reportage don't express opinions directly about the news reported. They'll just tell you what happened that day. They may they may quote other people, but they're not. The reporter isn't expressing an opinion. They report what happened. They give a lot of additional factual information. It may happen that you find statistics instead of just telling you that somebody was hit by a car on such and such a street corner. They might report that over the last 10 years, according to uh, the local cops, have been hit at that same intersection. And they might choose to quote a cop giving a reason why. Maybe the chief of police has a theory that we need a traffic light at that intersection. Um, they may quote people with strong opinions on the event. So, in other words, other people within the reporting may feel very strongly and say this is awful, but the reporter isn't going to say anything about whether or not he or she thinks it's awful. The point is to present the information as clearly as possible without intervening with opinion. But they do not tell the reader what to think about these quotations, although they imply that the quotation is faithfully related to the reader, and fact checkers really do look that up. The news organization that has fact checkers, though, is likely also to have a separate category of articles that they will publish called editorials. Editorials or op-ed pieces offer opinions, sometimes by experts and sometimes just by their columnists who have a perhaps consistent point of view on particular issues. Uh, and people who read different newspapers with editorials or magazines with editorials may find a particular political orientation to the world, for instance, within the editorials, but maybe not the reporting. And there is a difference between asking a wild question like, is the mayor a drug dealer? And providing a report that proves the mayor is a drug dealer. There's a difference between did the mayor used to be a drug dealer? Question mark. And here is the proof that the mayor is or was a drug dealer. I think you can understand that. That's is Janie a slut? Or here is her record with witnesses of sluttiness. And then periodicals usually produce editorials to engage readers in interesting questions about the news rather than to give them hard answers. If you want hard answers, you're going to have to do the reporting. The reportage and analysis provides the answers to questions, but sometimes reportage will make someone ask, is this a good thing? Or should we make a change in our community? And editorials are designed to do just that. Hence, just because my very conservative uncle hates what he calls the liberal New York Times, and he's right, it's probably really liberal to him, it doesn't mean it prints fake news. In other words, he can disagree with every last editorial the New York Times prints. Although, if he really read all of them, I think he'd agree with a few of them. That said, they have the best fact checkers in the business. They don't lie about somebody getting hit by a car at such and such an intersection on such and such a day. They may just suggest that you do something that my uncle doesn't want to do on the basis of the information. But there's a difference between lying and expressing a political opinion. And the New York Times has editorials that express political opinions that are often considered liberal, but they check the news. And also on the other side, my very liberal ad hates the conservative Wall Street Journal, but it doesn't mean that they publish fake news either. Why not? They have fact checkers over there too. They're going to tell you what happened, and they will double check to make sure. They are also very trustworthy. However, they have editorials that express conservative opinions with which liberals disagree. So, not a lot of super liberal people read the Wall Street Journal on a regular basis. That doesn't mean anybody. But given this, since there is so very little line in any fact check media, why don't liberal and conservative news organizations report the same information in the same way? Well, I have an answer for that. The answer lies in opinions about which questions matter most. And here's an example of how that works. Let's imagine for a minute there's a town. I'm thinking of Springfield from The Simpsons. And imagine that there is a conservative newspaper in that town in Springfield, and there's a liberal newspaper in that town, and Springfield has a mayor, Mayor Quimby. Here's Mayor Quimby from The Simpsons. And let's say that the mayor is a Democrat. That means some people in town like him and others do not. Necessarily, in most towns, there is a political division of some kind. This also means that the conservative paper will likely run negative editorials about him, while the liberal paper will likely run positive editorials about him, unless he does something really bad in office, in which case the liberals and the conservatives may agree about him. Let's say everybody agrees that the following facts happened, and both the liberal newspaper and the conservative newspaper report the following. Both mayors faithfully report that at a recent dinner party, the mayor was quoted as saying, "I don't think smoking weed is so bad. Maybe it should be legalized." Both papers, however, think that different questions matter about what he said. Everyone agrees he said it. The mayor himself does not deny he said the thing at the party. So what happens next in each newspaper, though, is very different. Here's what happens in the conservative paper. We see a guy in a suit carrying a revolver, and they run the mayor's quotation, the thing that I just said about smoking weed not being so bad, with another quotation from his conservative political opponent, the guy who ran against him the last election. And that guy says, not only does Mayor Quimby want to ban revolvers from playgrounds, apparently he likes to carry his revolver everywhere, just like that, locked and loaded. Now he wants to make kids on the swing set smoke marijuana. How could voters have elected him last November? I would have you notice that while politicians often say things like that, you might notice there's a huge leap between his comment at the dinner party about legalizing marijuana and suggesting that we pass it out to children on the playground. That there is probably a logical gap there, but that's the kind of thing he says. So, the newspaper quotes him. It's not a fake news story. That's what he said. They also say, asking aloud in editorials whether the mayor is a drug dealer. They had said, "Is the mayor a drug dealer?" ? They didn't say they had proof of that. They have no proof of this. What they have is a question because what he said upset them. They really don't want marijuana legalized, and they think a bad person would say such a thing at a dinner party. Here's Homer Simpson, dressed kind of like a Rasta guy. They asked the head of the Legalize It movement in town what he thinks, and let's imagine this is Homer Simpson here, and he says, "While I am encouraged by the mayor's recent comments, he is clearly all talk and no action. I am angry there are so many drug arrests in this town." That's how Rastafarian Homer Simpson feels. And along with it, though, they're going to give additional factual information. They say, well, okay, how many arrests are there? So they run the arrest statistics the man refers to because they're not upset by what the mayor said. And they notice his hypothetical comment at a dinner party is not the same thing as introducing a law to legalize a controlled substance like marijuana. So they might report, how many people in the last year in this town, Springfield, were arrested for smoking weed. And there's a difference between saying maybe it should be legal and saying here is the law I want the city council to pass. So that's what the liberal newspaper difference is that both news organizations are reporting the same basic facts, but asking different questions. Let's go over what they're asking in this hypothetical situation. And I think you can see the divide in America today. The conservative paper asks, how could a good mayor casually mention a desire to legalize a drug? I think that is the question they are asking, because they don't like drugs. They don't like marijuana. Were the voters wrong to choose a person who would hold this view? Did he maliciously hide an intention to legalize marijuana during the campaign? In other words, did he say he was going to build better playgrounds only because he wanted to make them distribution centers for marijuana? And that was what he was doing? And they're also going to ask, if adults smoke marijuana in private, how long will it be before children do the same? And does the mayor's comment point to a criminal economic interest in the, I'm sorry, that should say, drug use in town? The liberal paper, on the other hand, asks, how could the mayor say such a thing casually at dinner if he were so clearly unprepared to change the law? In other words, why be a tease, says the newspaper. If you're going to be the mayor and say maybe there ought to be a law that changes, you should be principled enough to stand by what you say, is their thinking. Is the mayor a hypocrite for allowing the police to arrest people for doing something that he says he thinks is not that bad? This actually comes up in real life politics. For instance, there was a man who was governor of the state of New York who was surely in charge for years when he was district attorney of prosecuting prostitutes. He did this while he was going to see prostitutes, including one year on Valentine's Day instead of spending time with his wife. He had to resign, and also he no longer has a political career because he's a hypocrite. People in authority having a double mind about the laws they're supposed to enforce sometimes causes people to accuse them of this. Is the police of the town overzealous in enforcing what may be an unpopular law, one that the mayor doesn't like that much? In other words, a liberal newspaper might ask, given the mayor's comments, why are there so many arrests? Do the majority of people who voted for the mayor agree with the mayor about the legalization of marijuana? Are there any people who voted for his opponent who also want marijuana legalized? That might be the kind of question a liberal newspaper might ask. And they might even ask the question very directly, should marijuana be legalized in town, like the mayor hypothesized? So these are two different impressions of the same factual event. And you can see how different they are. And that's really where we are as a country right now. Nobody lied. I've got my little dog reading the newspaper here. Again, nobody lied. There is no fake news here. Each news organization assumes its readers cares about different things. And each news organization thinks some questions are more important than others. When you're in the library, unless in some sensational story about recent political activities, you may still find that there are such controversies. Scholarly sources ask different questions from one another as well, and hence a difference in thought. And students need to pay attention to the questions in journal articles and books, as well as the questions they don't ask. Sometimes what they fail to ask is at least as important as what they do ask. On what information do they rely? Do they lean on only one source or a multiplicity of sources? In other words, are they leaning too far in one direction and present too narrow a perspective to be fully credible, even if, again, nobody's saying that they lied about what they did study? Is it a primary source like an eyewitness account, or a secondary source, an analysis of information? If any of you have seen Saving Private Ryan, a movie about landing on the beaches in Normandy on D-Day, you can imagine two different kinds of sources, one primary, one secondary. Imagine somebody who had lived through D-Day, who talked about getting out of the boat and being terrified and saying there was blood on the sand when I got there. I fell to my belly and crawled on my elbows toward the German stronghold. That's a primary source account. He can't tell you what aviation cover there was for the people landing on the beaches. He can't tell you about conversations uh, General Eisenhower had with Winston Churchill about D-Day. He can't tell you any of that. He can tell you what it smelled like on D-Day on the beach, but he can't tell you all the strategy. Whereas a secondary source, who was not anywhere near Normandy Beach on D-Day, can tell you about all the strategies, can show you maps, can talk to you about all kinds of other analysis. And in order to have a clear account of D-Day, it's probably a good idea to have information from both primary and secondary sources. For many things you will study in college, you will want to have both primary and secondary sources. Um, and in all such cases, as a college writer, I need to examine sources critically. Websites can be particularly tricky to evaluate for credibility. Here are some problems with websites in particular. Some websites are just clickbait, reporting on sensational rumors rather than on factual events. One way to judge that would be specifically, let's say the headline you click on is "Your favorite movie star doesn't want you to know this," and it sounds super sensational, like Anne Hathaway's secret. But Anne Hathaway's secret in the article is that she has a Labrador. She likes to walk. Well, that's not as sensational as the headline. You clicked on the headline because it sounded exciting. And the fact that a movie star owns a dog is probably less exciting than the headline suggests. People call that clickbait. Other kinds of writing is more like corporate media disguised as news media, presenting the best pictures of the agenda of a particular corporation's goals or industry's goals without regard to any legitimate concern about their goals. I have a friend who does this kind of work for a living, and she talks a lot about makeup. And she reports for all of these different blogs on what's the best lip gloss. Of course, the corporations that hired her to judge the lip gloss always sent her to have a favorable review. She's very good at what she does. And she has all kinds of makeup at her house because they always give her lots of free samples. But she is, if there was a cancer that was caused by lip gloss, and I'm not saying that there is, she will never report that in her work. She will write about how cute somebody looks when she wears the lip gloss. And so it may look like a news story, but it's not a news story. And it's important to pay attention to who is publishing that. It may sound like a news story. It may even say Makeup News or something like that, but it's run by Revlon, for instance, or Estee Lauder. Some communication falls into the category of infotainment, which means maybe it tells you 3 facts from the Surgeon General, but mostly it's trying to get you to buy a stationary bike so that your heart will be healthy, but also so that the person who paid for this advertisement for the stationary bike, looking like a news story, will make a ton of money. And sometimes creative nonfiction, it's not that anybody's lying. Lots of blogs will talk about things, but there's no fact checking. I run a blog. I have had it picked up by PBS, public broadcasting related sites, political related sites, and I have about 50,000 readers now. But nobody thinks that I am a reporter who fact checks. I am presenting nothing but editorial. Nothing but editorial. And some people are less obvious about that than I am in the blogosphere. And so it may look like it's fact-checked, but it isn't. And so it's important to try to figure that out. And some information, and this is the most insidious thing, I'm actually presenting a paper with other people about this very problem and how we teach people in English 102 how to avoid it at a national conference later this semester. It's not just my opinion. that the Russians attempted to manipulate American voters with false news stories during the 2016 election. It is the opinion of the FBI, the CIA, foreign news intelligence sources, all of our other intelligence sources, Army and Navy and Coast Guard intelligence sources, DEA intelligence sources, NSA intelligence sources. Everybody says this happened except a couple of Republicans close to the president and the president himself. I promise you that his point of view is entirely in the minority because our law enforcement authorities say conclusively that this really happened. And the reason why we can be so sure that the intelligence agencies that tell us this from overseas are telling us the truth is because it happened to them too. The French, the English, the Macedonians, the Spanish, the Germans, and many other countries, in fact, have had what's called a disinformation campaign constructed out of the Kremlin happen in order to manipulate world events. And as writer Gary Kasparov, who was jailed by Putin, says, that Putin being the head of Russia, he says that it's not like it was during Stalin's day, where Stalin would eliminate all other media sources and just tell his one official story. What he tries to do internationally is to create doubt in all news sources. In fact, if you have a relative who says, well, I just don't believe anything I read in the media, well, mission accomplished, Vladimir Putin. And that's something that my colleagues here at Southeastern and I think is bad, because we actually do need to have good information. We don't need fake news, but we do need news. And we need to know it is news. And the Senate had a meeting about this on January 9th, where they presented a very thorough recommendation of what we need to do. And one of the things they told America to do is what I'm doing right now, which is teaching you media literacy. And so one of the problems with websites is there was a barrage of disinformation that was designed to not so much convince us that Hillary Clinton was possessed by the devil and killed JFK in Dallas when she was in 8th grade or something like that, but rather to make us distrust any news media at all. And so I am fighting chaos in America by telling you all this. And honestly, there are some stories that are too crazy to be true without significant proof, no matter who tells them. Here's Hitler again with his dog. And this is weird news. It's not fake news. Hitler started a school with the Gestapo to teach dogs to talk during World War II because he thought that if they could talk, read, and spell, they could help us win the war. And he trusted his dog more than he trusted people. Now that's weird, and it doesn't prove he's sane. But he commissioned and I say in quotes, expert report, because I'm pretty sure this expert had a gun to his head, literally from the Gestapo, proving dogs could do this. And it doesn't matter how many degrees that author had, because until my dog can ask for bacon in English, I can't believe it. And so use your your prior knowledge about a subject and common sense, and then ask questions even when the experts tell you something is so. See what you can figure out. Like here I am with my pit bull cruiser. I adore this dog. But let's be honest. I think he's smart, but I don't think he can learn to speak English. If a vet told me my pit bull could recite Shakespeare as an English teacher, I would love that. But I'd be curious to see additional proof, because just because the vet said so, until it's something that flies in the face of my experience, I need to have additional information. Maybe the vet's telling me the truth and they've just come up with a breakthrough. I don't know. But what I do know is a good college researcher carefully weighs all credible sources and sees that if one differs from all the others, it may require additional information to accept that source's conclusion. And so I have a checklist for you. How can the reader of research material know whether he or she has found a credible source? Here is the checklist that helps students figure this out. I can be reasonably certain I have a good source when I know who's talking to me, like we've talked about. Here's what I know. I know the name of the author. I know what they know, why they're an expert, if it's relevant, their political affiliations, and what he or she might have to gain by telling me something. I know whether this person has a general reputation for being truthful. That matters too. I know what kind of publication publishes. That's as important as knowing who wrote it. I know whether this is a news organization that checks facts, whether it is infotainment, whether it is a not-for-profit with a mission to further a specific goal, or whether the story is trying to be sensational for a profit. To the greatest extent of my ability, I have eliminated the possibility that this is a fake news story from a hostile foreign government. And again, I wish I were kidding about this, but this is the time in which we live. I know why this was published. That matters. What was the goal of the publisher? Was the goal to produce, for instance, true news, or was he trying to promote a particular candidate, a particular product? Is there a profit for telling me one thing instead of another about this subject? If money would influence which report they gave me on the subject, I should probably discount that as a credible source. I know how the source squares with other sources on the topic. Here's what I know. I know whether it is an anomalous outlier or confirming more conventional views. And it's not that sometimes people can't be right just because everyone disagrees with them. That happens. But you have to have a pretty good reason to think they're right. I mean, people used to think the earth was flat. Columbus was right. His returning from the New World was reasonable proof that people don't fall off the edge of the earth if they sail too far into the Atlantic Ocean. Hence, we could believe the theory that Amerigo Vespucci had and others had that the world was not flat but round. I see if it's asking the right questions, and that is obviously very subjective, but you can certainly know if it's asking the questions of most interest to you as a researcher, and that it's not trying to distract you from different perspectives by distorting the importance of one piece of information over the other. In other words, if I'm trying to tell you that, let's imagine for a minute that I'm your mama and I'm telling you that you're in trouble because you used my car without permission and you crashed it into a wall. It does not disprove you crashed the car in a wall to say, oh yeah, but what about my brother? He snuck out of his window last night. I mean, that may get your brother in trouble too, but it doesn't repair the car. And sometimes news stories kind of do that, or fake news stories do, where instead of focusing on what seems most relevant, like there is smoke coming out of the engine of the car, people will point in other directions to try to make you not look at the thing that they don't want you to look at. I suggest you look under the hood. And it's important for any source to consider counter arguments in a manner that's not dismissive of them. You can't just say, well, everyone else is stupid except me. That's an unacceptable point of view because it's simply not true, no matter how smart you are. Other people may be thinking something different than you, and you have to consider why they're wrong, not just because shut up, because I say so. That won't do. If you follow this checklist, you have a pretty good chance of not being fooled by false reports. And meanwhile, this is my pit bull, Cruiser. He has yet to recite even one sonnet, and I forgive him.